So I'm going to talk about document and location for about 10 minutes with you. And Claire and Jenny kind of invited me to come and talk. I was supposed to insert what is staff research within the undergraduate research symposium. So my kind of interpretation of that is so that maybe we can kind of create some links for you in thinking about where does research go? Like, how do you take the kind of research you engage in, you know, as undergraduates, and how does that build into something called a research career? And I'm still working that out myself. So, and even though Jenny introduced me as Associate Professor Simon Morrissey, I've just become that. And frankly, that I've been working at UE for 17 years, and up until very recently, I didn't really understand how it all worked. So I've been putting it all together for myself. And I think one of the things I want to talk about today is some of the links between practice and practice as research, this term that you might hear a lot of, and how that kind of relates to academic research, or is it the same, is it different, are they two different things, do they coexist, and how do they coexist? Some ideas about interdisciplinarity, like how subjects talk to each other. And that's enough, isn't it? We'll kind of go from there. So document and location is a research group that was established at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, and went public in 2019. I'm a curator by practice. That's what I do when I'm not teaching. So I make exhibitions with artists, and I commission artists to make new works. And I think of myself maybe as a secondary creative. If people like artists and novelists and architects maybe are like primary creatives, they actually make new forms of knowledge in the world. I kind of think of myself as a curator, a bit like an editor. You know, like I bring together primary creatives and their ideas, and I weave new forms of knowledge and argument and enjoyment and discussion out of those. So document and location, there was a call for new research groups in 2018, and the idea of document and location sort of, for me, was like a curatorial project. It was about bringing together a range of practitioners from different disciplines to think around these kind of concepts, and the kind of subheading of the research group is investigating place and its interpretation. And it comes from really kind of positing these two ideas, document and location, which have that kind of impression of factual substance. We think of documents being the opposite of, say, fictions. You know, they're kind of evidence or records. We think of location maybe being different to place in a way. We think of it being a kind of more factual understanding of where you are. And I wanted to set up this idea of these kind of two seemingly factual ideas in a relationship to kind of then start to kind of pull apart how is the idea of place constructed through the way it's recorded, disseminated, interpreted. So I suppose in a kind of basic way that nowhere exists outside of culture, nowhere exists outside of discourse, and every place is formed through everything that's made about it, said about it, done to it, whether that's government policy, geography, economics, photography, art, fiction, and that actually we understand place through all these interpretations, and then very specifically the hierarchy that those interpretations exist in within the world. So where does, in a way, coming from a position of existing within a cultural discourse as a curator of contemporary art primarily, how does culture have an impact on that hierarchy of how we understand places, where we come from, what these places mean? Claire has mine on the thing. Cool. So drag is a sign of ambivalence. So that's not part of my presentation. You might have worked out. So is it not up there on that button?
It should be.
No, it's not.
I'll put it on the right side.
Velvet's probably been told you about that this morning, hasn't
The next one across.
That one?
Across.
Across.
You know.
See, I'm just existing in a place of very slow technology here. I'm slowing it down, I'm unlearning how to use the computer. So I'm not going to read this all out to you. I will provide this presentation to Jenny so she can share it with the rest of the material. But just to quickly pick up this kind of introduction from the website. So importantly for all the people within document and location, this is not simply academic research existing within academia, but it's where does practice and where does public output, where does the engagement with the public in lots of different ways, where does that interact with research and with practice as research? So how does a public program and research kind of interact? And what's been interesting for me, I was just talking about this briefly with Claire and Jenny at the beginning, is I very much feel that I've come from a place of practice and outputs. So what I was trained to do as a curator by my experience was make things happen in the world for audiences. And up until recently, that was kind of seen as the opposite of research. Research was doing things like Alec has just done, synthesizing lots of ideas and writing papers. And what I did was kind of outputs. But in recent years, the kind of academic research world has kind of been going through this change where it's now very concerned with ideas of impact, which is how does the stuff that we think about as academics within our ivory towers, in inverted commas, how does that have an impact on society? How does it change the world outside of university? And you can think about that in very direct ways if you think about medical research or engineering or something like that, making a new thing happen or synthesizing a new cure for something. But how do we apply that to things like research within art? And so this idea of kind of the output, something happening in the world beyond academia has become particularly important. And a lot of the people who I've pulled together into the research group were already very concerned with that. And so we're kind of in the programme going backwards and forwards about how do you kind of work with other disciplines who are maybe more like classic academic research and collaborate with them as practitioners to make new knowledge that maybe synthesizes both things and brings things. Can artists and photographers and cultural practitioners almost work as sort of conduits and questioners of research, and how do you kind of bring that to the public? There's a little bit there at the bottom about how kind of positing this idea that location can't just be defined physically and document cannot be just understood as a record, which is kind of mentioned kind of earlier. And this idea that we are using practice-led research to kind of reanimate and recontextualize ideas of evidence in the document through different forms of kind of sort of practice. So a boring list of people's names, not just there for its own sake. Some of these people you may recognise depending on what courses you're on. But the reason I wanted to kind of just put that up, apart from formally, is that there are kind of, in a way, like two different types of people within the group. So I'm a curator, like I said. Lee, at the top of the list, who's from photography, primarily works as a kind of book editor. Like he makes photographic books with photographers, and his practice is incredibly directional. So he kind of is a kind of strong critical collaborator with those artists, and it's very similar to the way that I act as a curator. So rather than this idea that there's a hierarchy in which the artist or photographer is at the top and the people who work with them, like the editor or the curator, facilitate their vision. That's me overrunning on my state in 10 minutes. So rather than them being facilitators, they're kind of creative collaborators in what the final thing becomes for the public. I know Lizzie Lloyd has just joined the group, and she's a writer. So in a way, the three of us are kind of like creative collaborators with artists and photographers, and people like Sophie or Huma or Mike, Aaron, they are artists and photographers who are engaged in the kind of in primary practices of research.
So I'm not going to go through at great length various people's projects, but what I'm trying to kind of do in this section is show that there's that kind of idea, the separation between the two types of work. So Huma is from Pakistan. A lot of her work relates between, and now lives in Britain. A lot of her work interrogates the relationship between Pakistan and Britain, both in terms of her personal kind of narratives, within sort of institutional and colonial narratives backwards and forwards. A project like Dry Cleaners was made in the kind of military district of Lahore, where she kind of documented the lives of these guys are like the batmen to the officers. That doesn't mean like Cape Crusader. They're like a kind of military servant. And they spend a lot of their time going backwards and forwards between the kind of officers' quarters and the places where they get their uniform cleaned. And this kind of, there's a kind of specific social hierarchy that's quite complex, that's kind of woven through that relationship and through Huma's documentation of what they do. And so to some degree that these projects start to kind of point towards the kind of idea of the document or the photograph deployed by the artist as a form of questioning device of social relationships and the way that information is kind of conducted. So Aaron's project Slant started from his father sending him police reports out of the local newspaper of the town he grew up in Massachusetts, and then he decided to go back there and take photographs that would then be placed in comparison with the police reports within a 30-mile radius. And something that started off being like a kind of witty play. This was kind of made 2016 to 2018. America was going through a huge kind of political change then, and this thing starts to kind of crystallize slowly over the 2 years that Aaron made it, through this kind of contrast of this, one form of kind of supposedly factual evidence from the paper and another of a kind of document made by him in response to it, into a form of kind of political commentary on what was happening in America with the kind of rise of Trump and kind of the idea of fake news and alternative facts. I'm going to whiz through a couple, otherwise I'll talk for ages. And to then talk about another kind of form of practice and leave, so this idea of those of us who are like curators, writers, editors, in a way it's kind of, they're almost like different forms of intervention. Like, how do you as a creative practitioner create a form of intervention? So people like Sophie, Huma, Aaron, they make the body of work, which in itself could be seen as a form of intervention into a cultural discourse, but it has to be facilitated then or collaborated with in another way, that body of work, and actually brought to a public discourse for it to genuinely start to have an ability to interact with that discourse about place, about our ideas, about society. And so Lee's practice specifically has been in kind of predominantly identifying young photographic practitioners, often from sections of society who haven't been traditionally picked up by the big photography houses. So lots of female photographers, lots of non-white photographers, and creating these incredibly beautiful, well-articulated photo books with them. And one of the things that we're kind of moving towards doing as a group is thinking how we, just flip forward a bit, how more of our activity is directed towards creating forms of intervention in cultural discourse. So what can we do with the projects? What can we do as a group? What can we do with a public program that starts to take things from the studio, from the journal, into a organised space where both people can have chance encounters with it through doing public events that you don't have to seek out, but then in which becomes a curated space that once you start an involvement with this discourse, you can follow it into more and more depth and more richer understanding. So one of the first things we started doing before the pandemic was a series of kind of live events, and that was really curtailed really quickly by the pandemic starting. So they kind of went on hold for the past 2 years, really. And one of the things that kind of came to prominence for us as a group during that time was making these things called file notes. So file notes are new critical texts on existing projects by members within the group as like a kind of foundation stone to kind of set a landscape of different projects that interact with the ideas in different ways, that bring new kind of writing, that commission new writing deliberately to create a new kind of discourse around those ideas and are then kind of disseminated out from the group. And so there's been one on Mike Rickett's The Vessel, which is in a way like a kind of investigative, almost like a journalistic form of practice, where Mike became intrigued with this prison ship that was moored in Portland in Dorset. It was the UK's only prison ship at the time he made it around 2013, and became fascinated with this, whatever you want to call it, architectural thing, this massive ship full of prisoners moored off the coast of a kind of effectively like mining island, was where they get Portland stone from. And he like then went through this whole series of kind of investigative practices to kind of work out where the ship had come from, what it had been before, where it was going to go, and it kind of pulls out this really fascinating narrative about society and punishment and capitalism. And because this ship ends up being like an accommodation block in the Nigerian Delta, being attacked by pirates and all sorts of kind of bizarre stuff. But this one object seems to be both at the top and the bottom of everything that's kind of in a way wrong with the kind of capitalist kind of wheel. And then we did one on Sophie's storage project, which you kind of saw some photos of earlier, where Sophie kind of has gone into museums across Europe over a really long period of time. It's a really interesting idea of like what Alec might think of as a kind of slow kind of project. I think an interesting thing thinking of Alec's presentation is the pressures that exist within culture as well, where now this kind of idea that you make work public very quickly and you don't have a practice unless your practice is public. How do you evidence it? How are you an artist if you're not showing anywhere? Maybe things have got a little bit better around that lately, but you know, up until quite recently there was incredible pressure around those ideas. Sophie's been making this body of work for like over a dozen years, I think, and it only really happens when she gets the opportunity, which can be quite hard to come by, when she can gain access to storage areas of museums, which is something that museums often don't want to give, because they're the objects that should be in the museum, seen within a museological framework, are presented as stuff. You know, so they're all stacked up on top of each other, or in this tiny little photo which you can't see here in this image, but there's like basically the carcass of some horse that was in the museum that started decaying and is in some massive freezer with loads of disgusting grot coming out of it. And it presents the private face of the museum, of the kind of the object stripped of its kind of narrative. And then most recently we did one on Aaron's Slant project with David Campany, the American photographic writer, writing on him. So there's also a sense in which we're trying to kind of build a sort of international network from these kinds of structures. So we're doing a file note on Huma in collaboration with an exhibition that she's doing in Plymouth between July and September, and hopefully we're going to be working with an academic from Brown's University in the States to write about her. And I've run over, so I'm going to skip that bit. But then talking about Sophie's work a little bit more, this idea that how do we kind of, in a way, kind of host, support, and kind of bring together different forms of research. So there's a section on the website called Fieldwork, where the members kind of show work that isn't finalised. So like it's not an exhibition, it's not a paper, it's kind of like notes, research, working process. This idea of kind of making something public for an interested audience before it's fully formalised. And it stretches from things like that to formal articles in journals. So this is Mike Ricketts working with a geographer called Daniel Keach, where they're kind of looking into the kind of specific social and cultural outcomes of flooding in a certain part of Somerset. The submersion and adaptation of routines in the Somerset levels and moors 2021. So this is like where kind of Mike's investigative practices very neatly link in with other practitioners from different discourses. And that's something that increasingly we're going to be doing, which is bringing in, at the moment, almost everybody in the group is like a writer, a curator, an editor, an artist, or a photographer, or an architect. So in a way, although it's called interdisciplinary, in my opinion, that's like soft interdisciplinary. Like we're all friends, you know, like it's all kind of practices that kind of go together. But one of the things that we're hoping and building towards is in bringing in people with genuinely different academic practices. So geographers, forensic scientists, economists, political scientists, and then creating relationships between the people within the group and them to kind of work on new projects and new knowledge. And we're working with a group, really fascinating group that are hosted out of Bristol University called SPIN, who investigate secrecy, privacy and ignorance. So they're the Secrecy, Privacy and Ignorance Network, and it's academics from, I think, 4 universities across the southwest, Bristol, Exeter, and some other ones that I've forgotten. And so we're going to be working with them on bringing their kind of interests and our interests together to try and make kind of new public outputs around ideas of secrecy and place. And then just to finish up, next year we're going to be kind of expanding the programme. There'll be a return to live lecture series in Bristol. There's going to be artist book publishing on top of the file notes. And we're going to be working towards site-specific research events, and by that we mean convening a group of people, both students, artists, researchers from other areas, the public, going to a specific place in the world, like Portland, for example, where both Mike and Sophie have made work, and then doing a kind of live research event over a number of days in which there are kind of presentations and workshops, and where everybody, regardless of whether they're an attendee or a presenter, kind of works together to kind of interrogate that place and think about how that place is kind of communicated and how the narratives around that place might be formed and how they might be impacted upon or altered. And then there's going to be new opportunities for UE students and graduates, once I've got the funding in place and the permission sorted, to start to interact in specific ways with the group's activity. There might, for example, there might be a student or a graduate writing bursary, so they can write something like a file note. So ways of kind of drawing in undergraduates and graduates into the culture of the group and its public outputs. There are kind of opportunities for people interested in that area of practice, rather than it just being about housing kind of established academics' work, but bringing on new people who are interested in those ideas as well. Sorry, I ran over a lot.
Thank you.